One of the great preachers at Harvard Memorial Church by the university of the same name in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was the Reverend Dr. Peter Gomez, who died in 2011. He was an exceptional preacher in the African American Baptist tradition. His mother was African American, and his father was from one of the Caribbean islands. And he had in his lineage, interestingly enough, Jewish heritage going all the way back to the Sephardic medieval Jews, the Jews who came from Spain. So some years ago, when I was at a conference at Harvard in Cambridge, I heard him preach in the university chapel. And Dr. Gomez was quite stirring. I have a couple of his books which have a collection of some of his sermons for the liturgical year. And so the story is recounted that on morning of graduation, like so many other colleges and universities, seniors gather in Harvard Memorial Church for commencement, and they hear the minister offer words of encouragement as they leave the university to take their place in the world. And the 1998 senior class heard the unvarnished truth from Reverend Dr. Gomez, who he came across as a kind of a Shakespearean actor, but it was also like, remember the TV sitcom character Frasier? Remember Frasier? Okay, that was Dr. Gomez. So Dr. Gomez, he was loved by the faculty and the student body, and he was the kind that didn't mince words to the graduating seniors at Harvard. And he said, "You are going to be sent out of here for good, and most of you aren't ready to go. The president is about to bid you into the fellowship of educated men and women, and here he paused for dramatic emphasis, and, he said, you all know how dumb you really are." Well, the senior class howled, they applauded, and they gave Dr. Gomez 2 thumbs up. They loved it. And while the faculty and the students knew Dr. Gomez well, it was reported that hundreds of bewildered parents who had come to hear stirring words at their son or daughter's graduation looked puzzled and confused and stunned by the minister's blunt words. And worse than that, Dr. Gomez continued, the world, and your parents in particular, are going to expect that you're going to be among the best and the brightest. But you know that you can no longer fool all the people, even some of the time. By noontime tomorrow, you'll be out of here. By tomorrow, you'll be history. And, my dear children, by Saturday, you'll be toast. That's a fact, no exceptions, no extensions. Nevertheless, he says, there is reason to hope. The future is God's gift to you, he said. God will not let you stumble or fall. God has not brought you this far to this place to abandon you or to leave you alone and afraid. The God of Israel never stumbles. He never sleeps. He never goes on sabbatical. Thus, my beloved and bewildered young friends, do not be afraid. And Dr. Gomez got a standing ovation from the cheering graduating seniors at Harvard. He called it like it was, and they liked that. What Dr. Gomez did for that senior class at Harvard, Jesus does for this woman at the well. Jesus is up in the north of Palestine, which is known as Samaria. And what's so unusual about this is that normally Jews avoided Samaria, and when they were in a caravan or journey, they would take the long way to go around to avoid going into the Samaritan north, because Samaritans were considered outcasts to the Jews, who considered them to be heretics. Now, why is that? Well, some generations back before Jesus, the Samaritans had married outside the Jewish religious ethnic heritage, and this was a total outrage to Jews. Not one of our kind. You get the idea. They were considered unacceptable to be called God's chosen people. So the Jews rejected the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews back. Surprisingly, however, Jesus seems to have had more success in being received among the Samaritans than he does, in fact, among a lot of his own people. Because the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. Over time, the Samaritans built their own place of worship up in the north on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And there they worshiped instead of going down south to the temple in Jerusalem. So here's Jesus, if you will. He's kind of on the wrong side of the tracks, and he's up in Samaria. So he wants a drink of water. This is the Middle East. It's the middle of the day. It's hot. So he stops by the well. Now, in ancient times, of course, married women went early to the local well to get their day's ration of water for cooking and for cleaning. The woman in question at the well was obviously, she was kind of, we might say, the town character about whom the other women had gossiped, because she'd had more than a few husbands, and currently she was living with a man who wasn't her husband. Well, we might say, well, what else is new? But this is 2,000 years ago. So the woman goes and she gets her water later in the day when she wouldn't have to meet up with all of these gossipy women who would be talking about her and called her less than kind names, if you get my drift. So here's Jesus. He's a Jew. He's an outsider. He's up in the north in Samaria. He wants some water. It's hot. He's talking with herself, a social outsider. He wants some water. It's the woman about whom everyone gossips. And here's Jesus, an outsider as well, up in Samaria. Two outsiders. So Jesus asked her, "Can I please have a cup of water?" Well, 2,000 years ago, women weren't supposed to talk to men in public, let alone a foreigner. So she knows he's a Jew. By the way, he speaks Hebrew because they had different dialects. So in response to Jesus' simple request for a drink of water, she talks back in an attempt, in an obvious way to kind of get rid of him. She's got enough problems on her hand, being the subject of, town gossip, and now here's this Jew. So she's actually a bit sarcastic, I think. She goes, "Whoa, hello, what are you, a Jew? You're asking me, a Samaritan, for a drink of water?" And he surprises her by telling her intimate things about her life, and she was shocked. Who's this man that he knows about my private life? She wonders. And she's determined to find out, so she says to him, not without a little humor, she says, "Well, sir, I can see that you're a prophet." Now, the woman frames a question in a way that fits the controversy in Jesus' generation. She says, "Well, sir, you're aware that our Samaritan ancestors, we worship on this mountain, but you Jews believe that the place where people have to worship God is down south in Jerusalem by the temple." In other words, she's saying to Jesus, so who's right? Are we right, the Samaritans, or are you Jews right? In other words, my version of religion or yours? Choose up sides. Name your division. Liberal, conservative. It's the negative side of belief. The business, if you will, the business of religion, kind of rearing its ugly head. And it's Jesus' response to that question it's important for all of us to hear. As he says to her, he says, "Woman, the hour is coming when you're going to worship God, neither up on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but true worshipers will worship God in the Spirit and in truth." In spirit and in truth. You know, it's hard for us 2,000 years later to kind of get, it was kind of what he said was rather revolutionary. That what he had to say in the minds of religious thinking people. No rabbi in his right mind would have suggested such a thing, that it's okay, you just worship God in spirit and in truth. I mean, we remember that Jesus was once accused of wanting to destroy the temple. There was a lot of terrorists in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. They hated the Romans. But Jesus, we know, had no intention of destroying the temple. But it's true to say that he took a stand against a lot of the things that the temple had come to stand for in his time. And he called it, which shocked everybody, a den of thieves. His point was that religion had become too involved in marketing. And so when Jesus went there were people selling cows and chickens and pigeons and doves and everything else, and money was being exchanged in the temple. We might remember that Jesus took a whip and drove everybody out because he said, "My Father's house is a house of prayer." Well, later on, the Samaritan woman at the well, even though her neighbors don't like her, she just, after this long conversation with Jesus, she goes back and she tells her neighbors who don't like her in the first place. She goes, "Hey, I want you to meet a man who told me everything I've ever done in my life. Come and meet a man who's told me everything about myself." God keeps giving us examples of who's important. But you know, sometimes we just don't get it. Because who are the first to hear the good news about the birth of Jesus in that stable in Bethlehem? Well, it's kind of dirty, smelly, minimum wage shepherds who were probably illiterate, and to them the angel brings good news. And now here was this woman who was considered an outcast by her neighbors. She knows Jesus. Even though she's an outcast to her neighbors, and she's an outcast because she's a Samaritan, to the Jews because she's one of them, those Samaritans. But the message of the gospel is simply this, that she knows who Jesus is. Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? The Good Samaritan, the Jewish priest, runs by the road on his way to hurry up and get to the temple, and a Jewish man, one of his own, had been beaten by robbers, left in a ditch. And then the Levite, who's like an assistant in the temple, he doesn't want to get in trouble, so he hurries on by. And Jesus always makes that point in his stories to his fellow Jews. And he says, "Now a Samaritan happened to be coming down the road." And I could almost imagine them kind of going, "Ew, a Samaritan? Them?" And Jesus says, "Now a Samaritan came along the road." And he picks up the Jew, puts him on his horse, he takes him to an inn, he pays for first aid, he pays for his room at the inn, and he tells him, "Just do what you can for this poor man, and I'll just put it on my bill." So Jesus says, who was a neighbor to this man who was left in the ditch? The point was their traditional enemy. And it must have been very hard for people to acknowledge that. The point of the gospel is that there's always going to be those who put a box, if you will, around God that say, God has to be defined this way, or God can only be defined this way. But Jesus didn't minister that way. True worshipers, Jesus said, worship in spirit and in truth. It's the spirit in which we are the church, and it's the truth in that we know Jesus enough to love him in all of our brothers and sisters. We can't say as Christians that some of God's children are more acceptable than others. So you have in this beautiful encounter in the long Gospel of John, this encounter between Jesus and this Samaritan woman, one outcast, if you will, to another. And he says, it won't matter one day if you're using right one or right two or whatever. He goes, because true worshipers are going to worship in spirit and in truth, because you can't restrict God to your own prejudices and your own fear. The gospel of Jesus is one of truth and freedom. We are a people of radical welcome. In that spirit, we remember Jesus and the Samaritan woman. In Christ's name, thanks be to God.